The room behind the wall. The blood on my hands hadn't dried yet when I realized the killer was standing right in front of me. But let me start from the beginning, from the moment I first heard a child crying in the walls of what was supposed to be my peaceful retirement haven. 3 weeks ago, I thought the worst part of my life was behind me. Jim's funeral, selling our house in Portland, the painful goodbyes to colleagues after 35 years as a social worker. At 62, I was ready for a quiet retirement in my late Aunt Rose's house in the picturesque town of Millbrook, New Hampshire. How wrong I was. The first thing that set off alarm bells was my cousin David's behavior when he met me at the Victorian house with its carved trim and turrets. His smile was too wide, his handshake too long, and his offer to buy my half of the inheritance for 3 times market value came before I'd even crossed the threshold. After years working with troubled families, I'd learned to sense lies as sharply as a dog smells fear. And David was definitely lying. His eyes darted around, his hands trembled, and sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool September air. But back then, I chalked his behavior up to simple greed. Maybe he just wanted the whole house. After all, New England real estate was expensive, and David owned a construction company. He could turn the family homestead into a profitable project. My first night in the house was peaceful. I settled into Aunt Rose's bedroom on the 2nd floor. Its windows overlooking Maple Street with its century-old maples. Falling asleep to the rustle of leaves, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. It lasted exactly until 3 in the morning. I was awakened by a sound that froze my blood. A child crying. Quiet, muffled, desperate. It came from somewhere below, from the basement, and there was something so hopeless about it that I was instantly wide awake. I lay in the darkness, listening, and the crying came again. This time I made out words, something in Spanish. A prayer? A plea for help? Grabbing a flashlight, I went down to the basement. The old house creaked and groaned, but there was no more crying, only silence and the smell of dampness mixed with something else. Something that made me clench my fists. Fear. Pure animal fear. The next morning, I carefully examined the basement in daylight. David had clearly done renovation work here. Fresh wiring, new pipes, patched sections of wall. He'd explained that Aunt Rose had asked him to update the utilities before she died. But when I studied the architectural blueprints I'd found in Aunt Rose's papers, I discovered a discrepancy. According to the documents, the basement should have been 4 feet longer. Where had that space gone? Tapping the walls, a professional habit left over from times when I'd had to search for hiding places in abusive homes. I found a false panel. Behind it was a small room with no windows. And here, my 35 years of experience became a curse. I instantly recognized this place. Scratch marks on the walls, desperate attempts to escape. Worn spots on the floor in a circle pattern. Traces from chains or rope. Stains on the concrete that could have been anything. But my experience told me it was blood. A smell that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. The smell of human despair. This was a prison, a cage for people. On the walls, scratched in childish handwriting, were names and messages. Sofía Gutiérrez, Guatemala. Help me, day 47. Anya, Russia. Mama, I sorry. Niran, Thailand. Want go home. The dates were fresh, some from this year. The last entry had been made just 3 months ago. In the corner of the room, under a loose floorboard, I found a makeshift diary. Pages torn from old books and magazines, covered in shaky childish handwriting in Spanish. My college Spanish was good enough to understand the basic content, and what I read made me grab the wall for support. Day 3. They said they would take me to my aunt in Boston. Why am I here? Why is the door locked? Day 8. Man in yellow hard hat brought food. He looks at me, strangely. I'm scared. Day 15. New girl in next room cries all night. She speaks Russian. They promised her work too. Day 23. I hear trucks. They take girls away. They don't come back. Where do they go? Day 30. Got sick. Cough won't stop. Man is angry. Talks about damaged goods. The last entries were almost unreadable. The hand was shaking, ink smeared with tears. Day 45. Doctor gave injection. Said for cough. But I saw how he killed another sick girl with same injection. Day 47. If someone finds this, my name is Maria Gutierrez. I am 14 years old. I wanted to help my mama. I didn't want to die here. After that, blank pages. With the diary in my hands, I went upstairs and immediately called Sheriff Tom Weller. I remembered him as a teenager, a quiet boy from a poor family whom the local elite had helped get a scholarship to the police academy. Tom arrived within half an hour, listened to my story, and carefully examined the diary. But his reaction seemed strange to me. Too calm, too prepared. He talked about the stress of moving, how old houses generate dark thoughts. He suggested that children had played in the basement, scratched the walls, written nonsense, but I was a professional. I knew the difference between children's games and cries for help. I'd seen real human prisons. When I pointed out the fresh dates, Tom suggested that neighborhood kids had snuck into the basement to play scary games. You know how teenagers like to frighten each other. I realized I wouldn't get help from him. But why? Was it simply reluctance to investigate a complex case in a quiet town? That same evening, strange things began happening. My cell phone started glitching, constant dropped calls, echoes on the line, as if someone was listening in. The internet worked sporadically, and around midnight, someone was shining a flashlight into my bedroom windows. The next day, I noticed David's construction company truck slowly driving past the house. Morning, afternoon, evening, as if watching me. David came by on the third day, bringing a pie from his wife and another purchase offer. He spoke about my well-being, claiming the house was too big for a single woman. Then he mentioned strange rumors, how Aunt Rose had acted strangely toward the end, seeing people who weren't there, hearing voices. Maybe it was hereditary. The threat was veiled but clear. If I kept talking about my discoveries, I'd be considered crazy. But I wasn't ready to give up. Using my professional connections, I began my own investigation. In the missing children database, I found Maria Gutiérrez from Guatemala. The 14-year-old girl had disappeared 18 months ago while traveling to her aunt in Boston through a family reunification program. When I contacted her mother through a translator at the consulate, the woman broke down crying. She told me about her daughter, a smart, responsible girl who dreamed of education and wanted to help the family escape poverty. Maria would never have run away, would never have gotten involved with questionable people. The photos the mother sent showed a cheerful girl in a school uniform with braids and bright eyes. The same girl whose name was scratched on the basement prison wall. I was holding evidence of murder. Digging deeper, I discovered a horrifying picture. Over the past 5 years, 11 girls aged 13 to 17 had disappeared in the area, all from immigrant families or foster care. All officially listed as runaways. But when I studied the details of each disappearance, I found frightening patterns. In all cases, the girls were last seen near construction sites. In half the cases, they'd been given rides by construction trucks, and in 3 cases, witnesses had seen a man in a yellow hard hat, exactly as Maria had described in her diary. The trucks belonged to David's company. At night, I heard those trucks. They came between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the whole town was asleep. Engines idling for about 20 minutes, then driving away. Sometimes I heard muffled voices, sometimes what sounded like crying. On the 4th night, I decided to look out the window. What I saw made me step back from the glass. 2 men were leading a young Asian girl out of a truck. Her hands were tied behind her back, and her mouth was taped shut. The girl was swaying as if drugged, but terror was visible in her eyes. One of the men was David. I didn't recognize the second, but his white coat under his jacket gave away his profession. A doctor. They led the girl into the house through the basement entrance. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. The cell tower had obviously been disabled. The landline was dead too, the wires probably cut. I was alone, and they were holding another victim in my basement. The next morning, David arrived with a whole crew of workers. They brought construction materials and pretended to repair the foundation. Actually, they were blocking my access to the basement. David apologized for the inconvenience, promising the work would only take a few days. He offered to let me stay at the local inn at his expense while the workers finished. I understood. If I left now, I'd never see that girl alive again. Instead, I pretended to agree with David's plan, but stayed in the house. Through the bedroom window, I watched the workers. They weren't repairing the foundation. They were building something new, pouring concrete, walling things up, creating new secret rooms. By evening, the construction quieted, but David left 2 guards. They sat in a truck smoking, periodically walking around the house perimeter. Around midnight, I heard what made me shudder. A child crying, the same crying that had woken me the first night. But now I understood. This wasn't Maria's ghost crying. This was a living girl crying in the basement. I had to do something. But what? The police were compromised. There was no communication, and the house was guarded. Then I remembered young Officer Mike Rodriguez, recently transferred from Boston. During our only meeting at the grocery store, he'd seemed like an honest man, not yet drawn into local games. Early in the morning, while the guards dozed in their truck, I climbed out of the house, through the attic window, onto the porch roof. Jumping into the bushes, I crawled 2 blocks to Mike's house. When I told him about my discoveries and showed him Maria's diary, I saw what I'd been looking for so long in his eyes: genuine outrage. He believed me from the first word. Mike explained that he'd suspected something was wrong for several weeks. Too many strange things were happening in town. Disappearing girls, closed cases, orders not to investigate certain crimes. But he was a newcomer. No one filled him in on details. We developed a plan. Mike would contact federal agents directly, bypassing local police, and I would try to gather additional evidence and, if possible, save the girl from the basement. But when I returned home, I found the guards were gone. The house was suspiciously quiet. David was waiting for me in the living room. He was no longer pretending. His face was cold and hard, and he held a gun in his hands. David explained the rules of the game without pretense. He knew I'd gone to Mike. In a small town, it's impossible to keep secrets. Mike had already been transferred to another district by urgent order from above, and I had to make a choice: sell the house and leave, or disappear like other curious people had. He told me about his business with cynical frankness. Human trafficking wasn't a hobby, but a family enterprise. David had inherited it from his father, who'd inherited it from his grandfather. Millbrook had always been a transfer point for smuggling. First alcohol during Prohibition, then drugs, and now people. Girls were bought from middlemen at the Mexican border, or lured with false promises of work. Brought to Millbrook, processed, psychologically broken, trained to obey. Then sold to big cities for sexual slavery or forced labor. Local authorities got their cut. Sheriff Weller, $50,000 a year for silence. Judge Milton, the same for closing inconvenient cases. Dr. Craig, for medical services for the merchandise and disposal of defective goods. Family, church, law, everything was for sale. David offered me one last chance. Take a suitcase with $1 million and disappear. Go to another country, change my name, start a new life. Or join Maria in the basement. I asked for time to think. David agreed to give me until morning, but under supervision. He locked me in the guest bedroom on the second floor, posting a guard outside the door. But he underestimated my experience. 35 years working with troubled children had taught me to find ways out of any situation. The bedroom had a window facing the porch roof. And in my pockets, I had a small folding knife. Jim's gift for my last birthday. Around 3 a.m, when the guard dozed off, I climbed out through the window. But this time I headed not for the exit, but for the basement entrance. The lock was simple. I picked it with the knife in a few minutes, another skill acquired working with drug-addicted families who often locked up their children. The basement was quiet, but I sensed a presence. Turning on my phone's flashlight, I found a new door, fresh metal, modern lock. Behind it was not one room, but an entire corridor with several cells. In the first, I found the Thai girl who'd been brought several days ago. She was unconscious, obviously drugged. In the second cell was another victim, a Russian girl about 16. She was conscious, but so frightened she could only tremble and whisper prayers. And in the third cell lay what remained of Maria Gutiérrez. David hadn't lied. They really did dispose of the sick ones. The remains were partially mummified by the dry basement air. On the skeleton's wrist was a preserved bracelet engraved, "Para mi querida hija," for my dear daughter, the same bracelet that had been in the photo sent by her mother. I photographed everything on my phone, freed the Russian girl, and tried to revive the Thai girl. But time was short, dawn was coming, and the guard would discover my absence. We tried to escape through the basement exit, but a surprise awaited us there. David, with 2 assistants, and Dr. Craig. Obviously, they'd planned a morning disposal. David no longer hid his irritation. He explained that I'd created too many problems. Police had already received an anonymous call about a house fire, a tragic accident that would claim the lives of everyone inside. Dr. Craig was preparing syringes with lethal doses. First the girls, then me. Everything was supposed to look like carbon monoxide poisoning, but they underestimated my self-defense experience. The courses I'd taken for working with aggressive teenagers had taught me several effective techniques. When the doctor approached with the syringe, I elbowed him in the solar plexus. He doubled over, dropping the syringe. Grabbing it, I plunged the needle into the neck of one of David's assistants. The effect was immediate. The man collapsed like he'd been cut down. In the ensuing fight, I managed to reach my phone and turn on emergency recording. Every word, every confession, everything was being recorded and automatically uploaded to cloud storage. David, trying to stop me, explained in detail exactly how the fire would be arranged, how police would find our burned bodies, how he'd collect insurance on the house and continue business elsewhere. And then something happened that no one expected. FBI SWAT burst into the basement. It turned out Mike Rodriguez hadn't gone to another district. He'd hidden and continued investigating, contacting federal agents. My disappearance from the house had served as a signal for the raid. In the following days, the true scope of the criminal network was revealed. Aunt Rose's house was just one of a dozen transfer points in New England. The investigation discovered and freed 43 girls aged 12 to 18. David, Sheriff Weller, Judge Milton, and Dr. Craig received life sentences without parole. Another 17 people, from truck drivers to immigration clerks, got sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. The Thai girl I found in the basement was named Pim. She was adopted by a Thai immigrant family in Boston. The Russian girl, Anna, was reunited with her family in New York. Both call me regularly. Pim calls me her American grandmother. I stayed in Millbrook, but Aunt Rose's house now serves a different purpose. We turned the secret rooms into a memorial for victims of human trafficking. On the wall where Maria had scratched her name, there's now a memorial plaque with the names of all the victims found. The rest of the house became a rehabilitation center for survivors. Psychologists, social workers, and translators work here. Here, girls who've been through hell learn to trust the world again. The center is funded by a foundation created with money confiscated from the criminal network. David had kept his profits in offshore banks. $28 million earned from human suffering. Now that money serves healing. When I planned my retirement, I thought peace meant absence of problems and responsibility. But now I understand. True peace doesn't come from inaction, but from right action. Maria Gutiérrez will never return home to her mother in Guatemala. But thanks to her courage and the evidence she left in her diary, 4 dozen other girls were able to return to their families. In this old house, behind whose walls so much pain was hidden, children's laughter now rings out as they learn to trust the world again. Every time I hear those voices, I know Maria didn't fight until her last day in vain. Her memory lives in every saved life, in every hope for a better future. And the blood on my hands that night in the basement, that was Dr. Craig's blood, whom I wounded with his own syringe while protecting Pim and Anna, the best use of my hands in my entire life. The house on Maple Street no longer keeps terrible secrets. Now it keeps hope. And that's a much better way to spend retirement than I could have imagined, sitting in that empty house in Portland, mourning a lost life. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what's worth living for.